Okay. All right. So we talked about learning goals last week. We went through some questions. We talked about the Winchester Mystery House, referenced some of the things that make nonprofits different, and we talked about the business model. By the way, I will also post these slides at the end of class today. So from session 1 and 2, those will be available in B courses. Um, so I think really where we left off was around this question of, are nonprofits allowed to generate profits? The answer to that question is yes, but the profits, go back to the bottom line of the organization, right? There's no shareholders for not-for-profit organizations. In fact, maybe what not-for-profit should be called is not-for-profit distribution or not for shareholders. Um, but profits are really important. And as we'll dig into this some more, um, what you'll hear me emphasizing is, if we care at all about organizations being sustainable, then we also really have to embrace this notion that nonprofits can and should generate profits, or embrace this idea that a surplus business model is a good thing for a not-for-profit organization. Gabe, you have a question.
Yeah, I was reflecting on that from when you mentioned that last week, but I'm also curious where, for example, religious institutions such as churches are classified as nonprofits. And so, do when you say that, like, sort of their revenue just goes to their bottom line or just goes back into the organization, but like for churches, it goes towards like technically a larger corporation that is, like, for example, the Catholic Church, it goes to like the Holy See. How does that sort of work?
Well, so full transparency, my area of expertise and focus is on the 501(c)(3 not-for-profit corporations. Basically, and sort of within that category, organizations across sectors. So I've worked with organizations, I think, in just about every subsector that's out there. Um, like literally everything from, health and human welfare to animal welfare to housing to, the arts. Um, and it's really focused on sort of the, kind of small to mid-sized all the way up to the larger nonprofits, right? I mean, you have Kaiser's technically a 501(c)(3. They've got a lot more zeros than any organization that I've worked with. But think of any organization from, like, 1, 2, maybe $3 million all the way up to 2, 3, $400 million. That's the sweet spot. That's the domain where I can um, answer lots of questions. As far as religious institutions, I've done a little bit of work with them, and I just can't speak in detail to what it means for those institutions when they're generating surpluses and how it works. But I will say, for the 501(c)(3s, um, the organizations that are here to serve our communities, that have a very clearly defined and approved charitable purpose in mind, those surpluses are reinvested in the business in a whole range of ways. And to not have that resource available to reinvest really is to the detriment of the organization itself. One of the best examples I can offer, because I've seen it happen so many times, is around facility maintenance, right? There aren't a whole lot of funders out there who get really excited about HVAC systems, right? Not a whole lot of passion in the philanthropic world around heating, venting, and air conditioning. They care about programs, they care about people being served, right? Not so much about the HVAC. But what I will tell you, having lived through this, is that if you have an old HVAC, and let's say that you're in San Jose, not far from Gabe's house, or you're in Richmond and you're in a heat wave, and the HVAC system conks out, that affects the people who are in the waiting room. That affects our employees, who, are, let's say, in an exam room that's starting to feel like a hot box, right? So, You've got this HVAC system on top. There are organizations that will support capital projects, but those are fewer and far between. So the question is, what do you do? Right? You have a responsibility to deliver on mission. You have programs that are dependent on this physical infrastructure. Where do you get the funds pay for an emergency repair? Right? And think of this from a personal example, right? So, you know, got a problem with one of the hoses in your vehicle or the radiator or, the alternate, whatever it is, right? You need to do a repair. You got the cash in the bank to make the repair or not? If not, you might be walking, right? Well, it's not a problem if your office is around the corner, but if you're driving 40 minutes, that becomes a real issue. So just, when we think of it from an individual standpoint or from an organizational standpoint, having those reserves is what provides the cushion to make sure that everything's functioning well and functioning effectively. And it can, those reserves can be used strategically. How do you build reserves? By embracing the surplus business model. So let's dig into some more content here. Okay. So this comes from the nonprofit starvation cycle. This is also one of the kind of golden oldie great articles that I share with all of my students in every class that I teach. And there's a quote in here which I think is really important. It ties to this notion of the importance of surpluses. What they learned, this is coming from Bridgespan, did this analysis. So the nonprofit consulting arm of Bain Consulting. And they studied a number of different not-for-profit organizations. What they found is that organizations, not-for-profit organizations, that build robust infrastructure, which includes things like IT systems, financial systems, skills training, fundraising processes, and other essential overhead, right? There's this word overhead that we'll return to. The ones that do this, that make this investment, are actually more likely to succeed than those that do not. And the reason why they're more likely to succeed, like, it's not rocket science. It's that all of this overhead and back office stuff is also inextricably linked to the mission of the organization and the organization's ability to function effectively. And sometimes that gets missed. Sometimes there's such a focus on the programmatic work that's happening, we miss the fact that we need all of this overhead to do business as well. Right? There's a bill out there right now that seems to think it's a really good idea for organizations in healthcare to not have more than 10% overhead. It doesn't rationally, in a practical way, operationally, that doesn't make sense, right? You need a payroll department to pay your people, right? You need your IT systems to fix computers when they break. You need an HR department to onboard and offboard and deal with employee issues and benefits, right? You need a finance system to pay your bills. Like, all of those things are infrastructure, right? You obviously want to keep it lean, right? You want to be efficient, but you can't scale it back to such an extent without hurting the mission-based nature of the work that you're doing. Carly.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that this was a really great article and very timely for me. I'm working on a grant to an organization to try and get them to run a $10 million grant program for us. And I'm arguing literally with the head of our organization, which is a grant making organization, about overhead percentages. And
Yeah.
she said, what do they need this money for? Why would they need 10%? I don't understand why we would pay them all this money when we're the ones giving the money for the grant. And so even within a nonprofit organization that gives out grants,
Yeah.
this is a real struggle. And I almost sent the article to her, and I decided I should probably just wait and bring up those salient points in discussion instead.
Listen, timing is everything when trying to convey a message. But the article is powerful, and it's one that's been recirculated, many times over many years. Carly, thanks for sharing that. There's so much we can talk about, and we will, especially as it relates to this notion of overhead and the incorrect perceptions about it. Sanaz?
Yeah, just a quick question on the article. I saw it was written in 2009, and like some of the points in the article reference, like, oh, post-recession, like this might change or other things. Have there been any changes or like further studies done since it was written, or is it pretty much the exact same now, would you say?
It seems like it happens in fits and starts, and so you get, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I mean, there have been entire conferences dedicated to the overhead myth. Even Charity Navigator, which is one of the watchdog groups, has, done press releases where they talk about the limitations of this kind of analysis. And yet, like to me, the evidence when there's really movement, the evidence will be shown in the fact that our audits no longer require us to break up our expenses into what's program and direct service and what's overhead. But at the moment, we're still required to do that, right? So someone somewhere thinks that this is an important thing. What you'll see, and we'll start to go through some of this, is it's intended, right? Are folks familiar with program to overhead ratio? I have a slide later on it, but I'll just kind of give you an overview on it now. Program to overhead is basically looking at the percent of expenditures for an organization that go directly to program versus overhead costs, which is, human resources, IT, finance, things along those lines. Generally speaking, if it's 80% program, 20% overhead, people seem to think it's okay. There are some federal guidelines, some indirect cost rates. For example, Lifelong has an indirect cost rate of around 30%. Not every funder will honor that, but the feds do because we've made the case as to why that's important. But there's so much subjectivity in terms of how you break out those costs. And let me give you one quick example. If you're the CEO of a not-for-profit organization, how much of your time is spent doing direct program work versus fundraising? And is there enough flexibility in there for you to make an argument in one direction or the other? We'll do an exercise around this a little bit later in the semester. So there really is, like, when your auditors come in, they want to know that you have a clear methodology and you're sticking to it. But in terms of determining that methodology for allocating the indirect costs, it's kind of a wide open playing field, right? So a metric that is intended to measure efficiency, really, if it measures anything, it measures how savvy the organization's leadership is in terms of allocating its indirect costs. One last point, and then Harry, I'll get to your question or comment. Our family, generally speaking, loves Toyotas. We drive Toyotas. My wife has a Toyota. My son has a Toyota. I had a Toyota for a long time. Now I have a Ford. But we still love Toyotas. Never in the history of ever has anyone ever looked at purchasing a Toyota and thought to themselves, well, I don't know if I want to buy this Toyota because I think they spend too much money on overhead. That sounds really absurd, doesn't it? Why does my family choose to buy Toyotas? Because they're safe vehicles, they're reliable, they drive well, they have good sound systems, right? Those are the things we're looking for. The same should be true for nonprofits, right? Are we investing in the impact that an organization has on its community? A decision to invest or not invest should not have a whole lot to do with how much the organization spends on its IT systems, right? So we can talk more about that, but you've heard my perspective. I'm off my soapbox. Harry, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks, Brent.
Yeah.
My question is either to you or some of the other kind of fundraisers, grant makers in the class. Is the core fear behind the overhead pushback, the fact that we shouldn't, we can't delineate between programmatic funding and overhead funding? Is the core fear that for a funder, their money would be used to sort of pad out other programs? Would there be are they worried about it being diluted and unable to sort of measure impact or something? I'm just wondering what comes up when you say, look, we need more money for overheads. Like, what is the initial objection to that?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I'm going to give you a high-level response, and I'd love to hear. I know we have some funders, fundraisers in the group here, so I'd love to hear as well from you all. But the short answer to that question, well, there's not really a short answer. One is each, foundations are different, right? So that it can be hit or miss. Some are much more flexible, some are much less flexible. So I think that's important. What I will say about, this program to overhead ratio is it's well intended, but it has a impact that's unhelpful, right? So think of it intent versus impact. The good intention, right? And if you're a funder, right, you're dealing with resource allocation challenges yourself, right? You have X number of dollars to give out and more deserving organizations than you could possibly fund at a given time. And so you have to be judicious in terms of how you allocate your resources. Well, we want to fund program. We're not super excited about funding your payroll specialist. That's not really what we're here to do, right? So that's the rationale. That's the intent. The impact that it sometimes has, the unfortunate impact, is that it hurts the business model of the not-for-profit because they don't have the resources to make these investments. And what you see here from the research that was done is that organizations that actually are able to make these investments in their overhead are actually more likely to succeed than those that do not. But sometimes it takes some convincing. I'd love to hear from other folks who either are currently doing funding or fundraising or are in the foundation world or have been. Carly, you unmuted yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I think in some ways it ends up just being a lack of understanding. And I'm not saying it's a failure on the part of the nonprofits, but I am saying it's like a lack of creative imagination on the side of the funders to understand, like, yeah, if I give this money to this group and I want it to do the most good, they actually have costs associated with doing the good, as opposed to just, giving the money to the good thing. And, when you give whatever, $100 to Planned Parenthood, you want it to go to like really important stuff. If you ask the average person, where's that money going? And if you said to them, oh, well, it's going to their Slack system where they, internally communicate. And it's like, well, I don't want to pay for Slack. I want to pay for something really important, like transporting women to healthcare facilities or something, And so I think there's part of it is the desire for your dollar to go to something that feels meaningful. But then there's also the component of nonprofits not doing a great job of telling that story of all of the pieces that go into making something successful. And really just in some ways, the idea of it being a nonprofit, people just assume it's like, oh, it's a bunch of volunteers just doing good. And so like, we don't want to pay them anything. So that's my experience. I also feel like at an organization that's like a science funder, it's fascinating because, we have a cap of 15%. We will not pay more than 15% of overhead for any grant anywhere. But universities often ask for 30, 40%. Research institutions require more like 60, 70% overhead, huge amounts. And the government pays for it, but it's pretty much just the government paying for it. Nobody else is willing to pay those percentages, even though there's very good justification for why you need to have them that high.
Carly, thank you for sharing that. I want to make one more comment. I know we've been sitting on the slide for a minute, but this is a really important conversation. Dovetails with everything that we're going to be talking about over the course of the semester. I did a project with a foundation in the Bay Area. This is a number of years ago. This is back. Anybody remember Access databases? We built this whole system out of an Access database that created basically a tool for nonprofits to clearly articulate the fully loaded costs of their programs, which included the appropriate portion of overhead specific to the program. And it was detailed out. And these were small nonprofits. So think $500,000 to $2 million. So they didn't have the resources to make, big investments in FP&A, which is financial planning and analysis or anything like that. But they were able to go through this process and we helped them. And what we found is every single organization we work with, we had a cohort of 5. Every single one of them were incorrectly pricing their programs to their funders. Every single one. Their programs were more expensive than they realized. But here's the kicker. It goes back to Carly's point. Once they had done this work, each one of them went back to their funders and said, hey, we went through this exercise, in this project, we spent a number of months doing it, and here's what we've learned. It actually doesn't cost us 120,000, it costs us 150,000. In every single instance, when they were able to explain or weave in the financial narrative alongside the mission-based narrative of what they were doing, using data to explain their points, every single funder adjusted the funding upward to cover the fully loaded costs of the program. And that's important, right? This is where owning your numbers ties to pricing. Pricing is probably the most important thing we can do to ensure that the business model is sustainable and sustainable through surpluses. Which, by the way, when we get to budgeting, but I'll say this now, does not mean we build a surplus budget. You probably want to build a break-even budget. Otherwise, you're going to get all kinds of questions that you don't want to answer. But we'll talk about that. All right, let's keep going. So we talked about the virtuous cycle or the virtuous loop. An organization that generates healthy surpluses, part of the impact on that, presumably, or at least to some extent, is that they're going to have a better cash position. But there's not a full stop there, right? It's not like, oh, great, we've got a better cash position. Now the board of directors can go to bed and sleep better because, hey, we've got a healthy cash position. It's what does the healthy cash position do to support the mission of the organization? Well, if you've got those reserves, that gives you the opportunity to reinvest in your people, in the infrastructure. Guess what happens when you reinvest in people and infrastructure? You get, generally speaking, improved results. You have your quality increases, your impact increases. Let me offer a tangible example of this. One of the healthcare organizations I worked with many years ago as a CFO, when I first got there, they were sitting on 4 days of cash on hand. I'm looking around for expressions and responses to 4 days of cash on hand. 4 days of cash on hand is really, really scary, you guys. What that basically means is that on Monday, we know that we're running out of cash on Thursday, right? That's how little cash we have. You're basically running on fumes. That's really, really precarious for an organization to have no cash. And there were some reasons why they were in that situation. By the time I left, they were up to about 90 plus days of cash on hand, and they've been in good shape ever since, which is great. But because they had no cash, there was a bunch of things that they weren't able to do. For example, in healthcare, the number one challenge with the vast majority of organizations is attracting and retaining doctors, providers. They had no money for the recruitment experience. Doctors had to pay their own airfare. They had to pay for their own hotels. Those resources weren't there, right? Once we started changing things around and started to build the surpluses and reserves, we were able to reinvest in our people through the recruiting experience. We were also able to implement this texting platform, right? It's not, cutting edge technology, but once we invested in the texting platform that, sent reminders to patients that, hey, your visit's coming up, everyone's received those, right? Our no-show rate dropped in half. No-show rate dropped in half, right? We got twice as much revenue from the standpoint of that many fewer people not showing up at our clinics, right? So all of this was contributing to this virtuous loop by virtue of the fact that we were profitable, we built up our reserves, and then we strategically reinvest in our reserves. Here's what happens when you don't do that. This is the place you want to avoid. This is the doom loop, you guys. This is not what you want, right? A situation where you're dealing with year-over-year losses, what sometimes people call a structural deficit, right? And then as a result, when you're dealing with year-over-year losses, right, you're spending more money than you're making. It's eroding your balance sheet and in particular, your cash position and your reserves, right? When those reserves start to dwindle, then you can't make the investments that you want to. You have to defer them. Because you're deferring them, you may end up in situations where you've got higher levels of turnover, right? You can't bonus people, you can't adjust the pay rates because you can't afford to do it. So the results go down, quality might go down, morale, burnout, right? All of those things happen, and you end up in this doom loop. What I will say from my experience, if you are connected to an organization that is in the doom loop, and there's definitely some out there, pricing is the way out. And what underlies pricing is having a clear and detailed understanding of your expenses. And then using that to price your products and services, using that to make maybe strategic adjustments. But that is the one thing that we have in our control, right? Is understanding and managing our expenses. Any questions on that? Jessica, any questions? You good? Awesome. Bobby? Zoe? Perry? All set. All right, let's keep going. So one of the things that's helpful for not-for-profit organizations, because I want to turn this whole thing on its head, and Carly, I may need some help from you on this, but sometimes when organizations start to generate surpluses and reserves, then you have funders coming back to them and saying, hey, you guys got a nice chunk of change on your balance sheet. You're asking us for X number of dollars, but you've got at least that much, if not more, on your reserves. Why should we fund you if you've got the money sitting on the sidelines? So the response to that is the development of a policy called a board designated reserve policy that explains the purpose or purposes for which these surpluses get reinvested. And here's a sampling of that. Maybe it's for an opportunity fund, right? We see all of these opportunities to develop and create new programs, and we need the resources, right? The startup capital to get it off the ground. And we're going to bootstrap it, right? We're going to self-fund that. We're facility intensive, right? You heard my HVAC example earlier. It's a pretty specific example. By the way, we have one building, the HVAC system was built in 1969. It's crazy. I mean, the amount of money that we've had to spend to kind of keep it up and running. We're going to do a full rip and replace, which is over $1 million. But those are the things that you got to look at. If you don't have the reserves, you can't do it. You know, a rainy day fund. Oh, I don't know. Maybe the administration changes, and all of a sudden we're looking at major cuts to our primary sources of revenue. Like, oh, I don't know, Medi-Cal, right? How do you plan and prepare for that, right? So if you've got enough reserves in place, it gives you a better runway to plan and prepare for those kinds of changes. And then, of course, as we were talking about earlier, investments in people and infrastructure. Questions on that? Andrea, good. Andrea? Awesome. Ben? Cassidy? All right, let's keep going.
Wait, actually, I have
Oh.
a question. Sorry.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how as a funder, surpluses and getting funding from other groups were like, okay, they're good, but they don't need us anymore. But that's very much a science kind of funding space. I'm thinking about, traditional nonprofits and 501c3s and like trying to get money. I can imagine there's a lot of pushback if you have this nice chunk of change on your balance sheet. And even, I mean, how successful is it to make a case that these are the things that you're going to be using it for? Is that something that most funders respond to? Only some funders respond to? Like, just wondering how successful that is.
I've found success with it in a whole
Great.
variety of ways. Part of it, years ago, one of my neighbors was a venture capitalist. He probably still is, down in Silicon Valley, doing really well for himself. And we ended up having a conversation, and we talked about, he had some real interest in the nonprofit space. I was definitely curious about, his VC world. And what was interesting was we both agree that whether it was a nonprofit or, tech startup, people are investing really only in two things. Only two things that people are investing. Everything else is a subset of that. Can anyone guess what those two things are?
I can, but other people's hands are up.
Yeah, so Bruce and Gabriel, I saw your hands up. I'm assuming you had related questions, but you're welcome to answer as well. And Carly, you of course can too. But what do people invest in? There's two things, two primary things.
Ideas and people.
Ideas and people, 100%, right? Do you have a compelling, cool idea? And do you have the leadership team who you believe will be able to pull this whole thing off, right? So first and foremost, that's what people are investing in. So this whole conversation around finance and financial management is only further evidence that the leadership team knows what the heck they're doing. That builds confidence, that generates dollars. That's basically what I've seen. You know, we've gone back, you know, in the organization I was at that was sitting on 4 days of cash on hand, we did a bunch of different things. The big money came in through pricing. I mean, we also restructured the balance sheet, restructured a bunch of debt, consolidated it. We also went back to a number of different funders, not to ask for more money, but to let them, to get them to agree to reallocate some of our line items so that we could optimize the contract, right? So there's all kinds of opportunities, but you got to understand your costs. You got to own your numbers. That's really what it boils down to. Bruce and then Gabe.
Just curious for kind of the rainy day fund on a different note, how are endowments factored into this, and how are you supposed to operate when you have like negative cash flows and but you're sitting on an endowment that you can't necessarily pull from?
Yeah. We'll talk more about endowments as we move through this semester, but a couple things just right now. So, you know, for folks, there might be some people are very familiar with endowments, others less familiar. Generally speaking, when we're talking about endowments, we're talking about permanently restricted endowments. A permanently restricted endowment means, you know, I'm a funder and I want to give Bruce's organization $10 million. But here's the thing, I want it to be permanently restricted, which means if Bruce accepts the $10 million, then that $10 million can only be invested. The principal or the corpus can only be invested. The returns on those investments can be used for program activity, right? But the principal you can never dip into. So, I mean, if you're in a situation, right, lifelong as an example, right, where the HVAC system conks out, we can't dip into that $10 million to replace the HVAC system per the donor requirement or the donor intent. So when we're talking about endowments, that generally speaking is what we mean. Does that make sense to everyone? Are there any questions about that? Okay. Now, there are some 501c3s out there that have really successful business models that include endowments. I think I mentioned this last week. Harvard University, great example. When you look at their balance sheet, right, what you will see, Clara Miller used to say this, some of her articles, right? It is a real estate company and an investment house with a small school attached, right? The issue for many of the small to mid-sized nonprofits, which is certainly where I've spent most of my time, and probably many of you all as well, it takes an enormous amount of energy and effort to build that permanently restricted endowment. And it sometimes comes at the expense of the operating fundraising that you need to do, right? So we'll talk more, you know, kind of more about that. But the, you know, the endowment piece is really a tricky one. What I would say is for organizations, the recommendation to the extent that the donor will accept this, a quasi endowment, right? This is where the board designated reserves come into play to say, look, we don't want you to restrict the dollars, but we will have board oversight and your resources can be applied to our facility and opportunity fund, right? And then the leadership team has the flexibility. If they want to dip into the corpus, they can. If they want to invest it, they can. But the second is permanently restricted. That's it. Gabe.
So I see, well, of course, we're talking in surpluses, but I'm also curious, what's a general best practice when starting up a new nonprofit? Is it focusing first on the overhead and then the people and programs, or is it the opposite, where it's focusing on the programs and the people, and then you can start building up the overhead?
if you're in startup mode, and we'll talk about this in the second half of the semester, taking the time to really build out a robust financial model and then pressure test the hell out of it. Because you want to get it wrong in Excel and not get it wrong in the real world, right? And when I say pressure test it, what I really mean is test the assumptions that are driving the model. And that will, by virtue of going through that process, reveal your questions around, overhead versus program specific, because each new startup is going to look a little bit different, right? It's hard to say, well, it always has to be one way or the other. But modeling it out, and it comes back to what Carly mentioned earlier, is about ideas and people. By going through the process, the right process around financial modeling, it's going to make the leadership team that much smarter around the drivers of success or failure for this startup. And oh, by the way, probably the most important thing to do for the startup is quantify how much growth capital do we need to get this thing off the ground. Unless you've got the resources already, or you've got a wealthy uncle or whatever it is, right? You're going to need some startup funding to get this thing off the ground. Well, how much and for how long? Have you gone through that exercise where you can clearly articulate and justify that answer? Harry, you have a question.
I'll be quick. Going back to this surplus conversation with, a funder, and they're saying, why do you have 90 days surplus? How does that conversation usually go when you're pushing back on that? Like, what would you say in that specific, because it seems like a pretty big torpedo potentially to sink the the attempt to get fee.
So I'm not a fundraiser, but I've been around it. And the people who are fundraisers and very good at it will tell you some very basic things that are so obvious and yet so powerful at the same time. So they will say things like, part of my success of fundraising is simply doing what I say I'm going to do and saying thank you, right? A CEO who I worked with, I was on the board of, because I always thought of fundraising as kind of being sort of annoying and difficult. I'm not a grip and grin kind of guy. I don't enjoy those events. It's not my thing. But what he said was, he's like, Brent, I love fundraising because I'm sitting with people who are as passionate as I am about the work that I'm doing, right? And so it's important to understand that, like, there's a real partnership there with your funders. And so, by bringing authenticity to what's happening, right? Again, it comes down to idea and people. And, part of trust in the leadership is, how well do they understand financially what's happening with the organization? There was an arts organization I worked with years ago. It's called On the Boards up in Seattle. If you ever go see their performances, they're great. They put out some edgy performances. But they have, as many performing arts organizations, they've got this dual leadership model where you have an artistic director and a managing director as co-leaders. But they would go into these funder meetings, and the managing director would talk about the artistic vision and the artistic director would talk finance. And the funders just loved it. Like, they absolutely loved it. They were so impressed by all of that, right? So, so much of this is relational. So much of it is reputational, right? All of those things really matter a whole lot. So it's not so much about getting fixated on the surpluses. It's recognizing it's important and making sure that you understand your business model and you're effective in communicating it to the people who you're interested in having you invest, having them invest in it. All right, let's keep going. Here's another question. This is a good question. Who buys the products and services of the nonprofit? Jessica, what do you think? Who buys the products and services of the nonprofit?
The public. I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of nonprofit you're talking about, but I mean,
enough.
plenty of nonprofits like sell services.
Absolutely, right? So if you're going to SF Jazz or the SF MoMA, right? Both of those are nonprofits, right? You're paying some ticket fees, and so certainly it's the customer or the community that's paying for it. Who else pays for or buys the products or services of the nonprofits? Perry, what do you think?
Funders. who
Yeah.
are looking to, use capital to, support programs.
Yep. And so between Jessica and Perry, by the way, the two of you are right next to each other. So I kind of went to the corner here. That fundamentally is our funding model in the nonprofit space. The earned revenue is the example that Jessica provided. The contributed revenue is the example that Perry provided. And what I will say is that the fundraising side, the contributed revenue side, is inescapable. Nonprofits exist, remember, because there is not a commercially viable alternative. Despite many, many efforts and some very well-intended MBA grads who have talked about these earned income ventures, which is not a bad thing, but fundraising is inescapable. It's an integral component to our business model. So when we're modeling, we want to model out also the contributed revenue requirements as well. But it's these third-party payers that actually makes the nonprofit business model, I would argue, more complex than the for-profit business model, the traditional model that you see here, right? The traditional model is pretty straightforward. You have a service cost, right? And the service cost, think of it on a per unit basis, right? Includes on a per unit basis all of the direct costs, all of the indirect or the overhead costs. And oh, by the way, you know what else gets built into the service cost for profit, right? Is profit, surplus, right? If you're buying a cup of coffee at Starbucks, you better bet that they're baking surplus into the service cost. But when service cost equals customer fee, you're in good shape. Everyone with me on that? I think it's pretty basic concept, right? In the nonprofit space, it's split, just as we were talking about with Jessica and Perry, right? Depending on the subsector, which is absolutely the right point. There's, if you are a performing arts organization, the split is probably 50-50 between the earned revenues, what the customer is actually paying, and then the third party payer, those contributed revenues. If you are a homeless shelter, there's not going to be much of anything coming from up here. It's going to be 100% contributed. Advocacy organizations are like that as well, right? So subsectors are going to vary. But the notion is still the same. You've got a service cost. It's just the service cost now gets divided up between arguably what are two customers. And this is part of what, when you're a CEO in the nonprofit space, makes your job more complex because you're serving multiple customers. And sometimes what the customer or the client or the patient that you're serving needs doesn't fully align with what your other customer, who's your third party payer, thinks they need. Right? I don't know if anyone's been through that, but the funder has one idea. The people who are serving, in your organization, serving the client or the patient have a different idea, and there needs to be some alignment around it. But the idea, again, still is service cost, right, needs to be equal to whatever the customer fee is, plus those third-party payers. And oh, by the way, when it comes to the service costs with the not-for-profit model, be very careful of the price anchoring. What do I mean by that? Let's talk about this for a quick second. Carly, I imagine you have some experience with this. Others might as well. But if you're pursuing a grant from a foundation, you've done some research, you've gone onto their website, you've looked at what they've funded before, and there's a grant opportunity, right? You've met with a program officer and they say, hey, absolutely, we'd love to see you put in a proposal. So you write up the proposal and you get to the point where you put together a budget. How much are you going to ask for when you prepare this budget?
More than you need.
Okay, I saw you nodding there, Zoe. I thought you might answer that.
Yeah.
more than you need. Okay. That sounds okay to me. That sounds good. What else? What others think? Right, imagine you've gone now, you know the funder, you kind of know how much they fund. How much are you going to go after? It's a slight variation on what Zoe was saying.
The max amount.
Yeah, who said that?
Jessica.
Jessica, where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay, sorry. I've got a lot of students in this class. Yeah, the max rate. I'm going to ask for as much as I can get. That's oftentimes the case, right? I'm going to go after this grant and I'm going to pursue as much as I can possibly get. But what's the challenge with that? The challenge is, let's say that the max you can get is $200,000. That's great. But here's the question. What's it costing you to deliver? Do you know? Sometimes we get so fixated on the top line. Do you all know what I mean when I say the top line? We're talking about revenues, right? We get so fixated on the top line that we miss the midline or our expenses. $200,000 is a great outcome for a grant unless it's going to cost you $300,000 to deliver on and administer that grant, right? This is where the expenses come into play, and the price anchoring is we agree to 200,000, but it costs us 300,000. It's a whole lot harder later on to go back to the funders and say, oops, it's actually more expensive than we thought because they're used to getting a service now for 200,000. That's the point on that. Carly.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this is a really interesting problem because I think depending on the funder, their order of magnitude is very different, right? 10,000, 100,000, a million, like those are very different numbers. And I've worked for 2 funders now that were like, no, we don't want to tell them our number. We want them to just tell us what they need, which I found incredibly frustrating because it's like, well,
Sure.
that's not a good model because yes, my organization right now could give you a grant of $10 million, but are we going to? Probably not. Like, if you asked for $10 million, will we give it to you? Probably not. But like
Right.
that tension of what they have in mind, what you actually need, what you're going to ask for, is it a negotiation? Like, it's a really interesting challenge.
I agree. Zoe, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I work in nonprofit fundraising. I'm a development director for a nonprofit in Seattle. And yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Like one is that even when you ask for the max amount, a lot of the time they're not going to give it to you. They're going to say, we don't want to be the only funder for this program, maximum, maybe we'll want to support 30% of it. You need to find the other 70%. Then there's also just the idea of, okay, you've created a budget now for this funder that shows that your program is, I don't know, $1.5 million to run, but they come back to you and they're going to give you $400K. How are you going to run your program with $400K if you don't necessarily know where the other, $1.1 million is going to come from? You have to significantly scale down your program to make sure that you can stay within your budgetary means. But then what's the impact? Is the impact actually getting at what you originally wanted the program to be? So yeah, lots of interesting factors there.
I hope everyone paid close attention to the last 2 comments here, because in the real world, this is exactly what happens, right? You have funders who are really looking for, and again, understandably so, right? There's in the accounting term is concentration of risk, right? What a funder doesn't want to do is create a level of dependency if at some point down the road they pull funding out, right? The entire thing collapses. So they want to know that there's some diversity of revenues to support the organization, which is fair. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. The other point that is so important is, if it's costing you 1.5 million, but you're only getting 400,000, you better not put your deliverables at the $1.5 million mark because that's not the money that's coming in, right? Communicating early and often with your funders, being transparent about it, relationship building trust. I mean, reputation matters a whole lot. Right, Zoe? I'm assuming you agree with that. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, if you blow it, right? Let's say you get the 400,000, let's say you get the 1.5 million, but you don't deliver on what you said you're going to deliver on, what's going to happen? Are they going to make you pay the money back? Probably not. But what also is not going to happen?
You won't get funded again.
Yeah, you're cooked. You're toast. Right? Because part of the sustainable business model is making sure that you get access to those repeatable, renewable sources of revenues over time. And so, doing what you say you're going to do definitely matters a whole lot, right? So, again, it's a lot of this is just very practical. All right, let's keep going. So next question. This is kind of a rhetorical question. But is overhead a necessary cost of doing business? I'm assuming and hoping everyone's saying yes to that, right? So let's talk about this for a second, right? In the for-profit world, we looked at the business model. And we've got this cup of coffee, right? A cup of Joe to go. And on a per unit basis, you've got the ingredients for the coffee, right? It's the coffee, it's 12 cents. You got the dairy, 5 cents. You've got the cup and the lid and the sleeve. Those aren't really ingredients. Those are just the materials, right? And then you've got your overhead costs, right? You've got your labor, your rent, marketing the cup of Joe to go, G&A is general and admin, think everything else that doesn't fall into the categories above. And then, oh, by the way, here's your operating profit, right? So if the service cost for this for-profit cup of coffee is $2.49 and the customer pays it, that model works. You could actually scale that, right? That looks pretty good. Now, what happens in the nonprofit model, right? The we are happy to serve you cup of coffee, where let's assume for the moment, all of these line items are the same. You have $2.49, but you've got, let's just say a customer, in this case, let's call it the funder, who's only able to cover $2. And let's assume for the moment that we can't increase the revenues. What do we do then? Where do we make the adjustments? Well, maybe we take off the lid and the sleeve and we just have the cup. So now you've got a somewhat inferior product, but whatever, we save a little bit of money there. But otherwise, what else are you going to do to get the customer fee to match the service cost? What's likely to get cut here? What's the biggest line item?
Profit. G&A.
Oh yeah, so let's take
Labor.
the profit out, right? So now we're at break even. And then what comes next? What's the other big line item?
Labor.
Yeah, it's your people, right? And so then you end up in this situation where you're underpaying and overworking people. You end up in the sweat equity model, which leads to burnout and all of those other things, right? So it just does come back to the importance of really understanding your costs, the fully loaded costs. We will do an exercise later on in the semester that also looks at what full cost recovery is and the process by which you allocate those indirect costs. But that gives us an opportunity to enter into these conversations with clarity. What is really required to cover the fully loaded costs of these programs, right? That's what we're there to do. Last question, we'll talk about this for a minute, and then we'll take a little bit of a break. Is cash always fungible in the nonprofit sector? And by fungible, that means flexible, right? Can you use cash for anything that you want, or are there some limitations? Is cash always fungible? What do y'all think?
No.
Who said no? Gentlemen,
Oh,
why
that
not?
was me.
Why not?
Well, whenever there's a never and always, my inclination is no, never. But specifically for multi-entity organizations, C3, C4, 527, money donated, funded, or allocated for any of those specific entities cannot go move between necessarily unless there's one way I think you can donate, and I forget it because I haven't had enough sleep, so apologies.
I totally
I know that
understand
there
that.
is one way that you can move money. I think the C3 can donate to the C4 of a multi-entity organization, but a C4 cannot donate to a C3, or it's the other way around. It's one of those.
No, you had it right the first time around.
Okay,
Right?
great.
So the C4 is the one that does more of the lobbying. And there's actually, so gentlemen, thank you for that. There is one specific word that I'm thinking for when we're talking about cash and whether it's flexible. Ben, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to add that the nonprofit that I worked at would sometimes get grants that were, I don't know what the word was, but they were for a specific service or a specific product, and that's
Yep.
what they wanted us to deliver. And then other times, and these are the ones that we liked more, were the ones where it was like, here's money, go operate. You're doing a
Right.
great job. Keep going.
the latter is the gen op support, right? The first is you defined it really well. What's the word I'm looking for, y'all?
Restricted.
Restricted, yeah. So if this is donor intent, right? And if the donor has restricted funds, then that limits your ability in terms of how you use it, right? So in the, God, I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, the accounting body came in and did a little bit of window dressing. They changed the word restrictions or unrestricted and called it without restrictions, and called temporarily restricted, included it with restrictions. Same thing with, we talked about permanently restricted. This is the endowment. Temporarily restricted, this really starts to get to the heart of what makes nonprofit business models so counterintuitive and complex. We're going to spend a little bit of the time after the break doing some financial statement analysis as sort of an entry point. We'll be doing a lot more of it. But part of the challenge is understanding the nature and sort of the flow of these restricted dollars, these temporarily restricted dollars. So temporarily restricted dollars are dollars that the donor says, basically it's based in sort of 2 criteria. It's either a purpose restricted grant or a timing restricted grant. The purpose restricted grant is, hey, I'm going to give you $100,000, but you can only use it for the youth program. You have a senior program that needs the money, it's a no-go, right? Those dollars are earmarked for the youth program, right? General operating support means that you can use it for whatever you want. Those dollars are harder to come by. Most funders are going to restrict it for a specific purpose. There's also something called timing restricted grants, which is the multi-year grant. And I'm going to say something about multi-year grants, and it's not going to make a whole lot of sense, and that's okay. I promise you that by the midterm, it's going to make a whole lot of sense. But here's what you need to know about multi-year grants. Under the generally accepted accounting principles and FASB, I think it's 116 or 117, I can't remember, the financial accounting standard boards. This is where I get all wonky. Nonprofits are required, they are required to book the full amount of the grant, a multi-year grant, the year in which it was committed, which is a really weird thing to do. So anyone who's taken accounting classes, think of it as you're recognizing deferred revenue on the income statement as compared to dropping it on the balance sheet and releasing it when you've earned the service, right? But in the nonprofit space, you're required to book the full amount of a multi-year grant the year in which it was committed. Problem with that is if you don't know how to interpret the income statement, it may show that you've got a lot more revenue in a given year than is really available for your use, because you've got this multi-year restricted grant. You've got a bunch of dollars that are flowing through the income statement that are actually restricted for future use. I'm laying this out as a concept. We are going to look through this multiple times. This is probably one of the key points that's kept me gainfully employed at the University of California, Berkeley, teaching this class for so many years. So this is important. I want to make sure you all understand that. So we talked about permanently restricted earlier. That's the endowment. Temporarily restricted, right? This is donor intent, donor imposed restrictions, either its purpose or timing. And then unrestricted or without restrictions, this is just earned revenues, right? So the ticket sales, or unencumbered contributed revenues. Ben, I think you referenced it as sort of the general operating support. But the idea is, hey, we're going to give you a grant. You as an organization, you make the decision in terms of how you want to use it. Any questions on this? Oriel. Oh, wait. Yeah, Oriel.
Yeah, I guess I just had trouble with the term temporarily restricted because the money, it's never unrestricted, right? It's
it is
always
actually.
restricted and then you spend it.
Nope, not exactly. So that's an excellent question. So the way it works, and we'll see an example of this after the break, it starts off restricted, and then it actually gets transferred into the unrestricted column when those funds are applied to the expenses for which they were intended. So again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. It's going to make more sense once you see a spreadsheet, but think of it this way. You've got your checking account where you pay all your bills, and you've got synced up with your checking account a savings account, right? So think of those restricted dollars as coming into your savings account, and you're only transferring it into checking when you plan to use it to spend the dollars for which they were intended. The same thing with restricted and unrestricted. So it starts off as restricted, and then once you are going to apply those revenues, right, to the activities that you've agreed to, you literally, it's literally an accounting step where you transfer it from this bucket into this bucket, or this column into this column. Conceptually, it sounds wonky when we look at a spreadsheet, and we'll look at it after the break. It'll start to make more sense. But Aurel, thanks for bringing that up. All right, we're at about 6:18. That's what I see at my time. We're going to meet back up at 6:30, and we'll do some exercise work together with the 30 minutes that we'll have left. I'll see you guys in about 12 minutes. All right, everyone, we're back. Let's go ahead and get started again. Can everybody see the screen? Awesome. All right, there's a little bit more content that I don't want to skip, but I want to make sure we take a minute to cover it, and then there is some exercise at the end of this that we'll go through here. Okay, so in terms of business model tendencies, just to wrap up this section, there are some distinctions from what you see in the for-profit and the nonprofit space, and it's important to understand them, in part because it'll give you a better sort of better insight into the nonprofit business models and some of the challenges that we face. And some of it is tied to, kind of the way in which nonprofits are funded and financed. In the for-profit world, there very clearly is a pricing structure, right? That's a key area of focus in for-profits, right? How do we price our products and services? In the nonprofit space, there is this bend towards service structure. And what I'm saying is, this is one of those instances, and I'm not someone who is a huge advocate of taking for-profit approach and applying to nonprofits and assuming that everything's going to work better. That's many times not the case. But in here, there really is some value in nonprofits really thinking carefully about pricing, right? As compared to, hey, these are the services that we deliver, and how we price those services are kind of an afterthought. And it really does come back to the fact of, controlling the controllables, and expenses are what we have the most control over, right? In the for-profit world, if you have excellent financial results, chances are you're going to get more money. In the nonprofit space, not so fast, right? New administration comes in, there's turnover at the board of directors for a foundation. There's all kinds of factors that you might be really doing fantastically well, both in terms of your mission and in terms of the financial results that you're achieving as well. And the funding may very well shift for reasons that are far outside of your control. So as a nonprofit leader, you really want to have kind of your pulse on the fundraising ecosystem that you're part of as well. In the for-profit model, we are investing in companies, right? There's not a lot of funders who are saying, hey, look, I'm going to give the money, but you can only spend it for the development of the Toyota Highlander, right? It doesn't work that way. But in the nonprofit space, oftentimes we're investing in programs as compared to the entire enterprise and the entire organization. And that's just the reality of where we are right now. And finally, and this might be the most important, in the for-profit world, impact is pretty easy to measure because either we're profitable or we're not, right? In the nonprofit space, impact is very difficult and costly to measure. And I say this in part, I'm in healthcare, right? If there is any subsector in the nonprofit space that should be able to measure impact effectively, it's in healthcare. Why? Because with the passage of the Affordable Care Act that goes back to 2011, one of the requirements was a transition over to electronic medical records, right? So as compared to all of the charting that was done on paper, now, actually most healthcare organizations are on their second iterations of EMRs. Everyone's moving to Epic or, kind of the big systems that the hospital uses. And so we've got all of the data, right? All of those clicks are done. And even in healthcare, it's really difficult. I mean, the whole notion in the Affordable Care Act around payment reform is the idea of moving from a volume-based business model, right, where we get paid for, if we see more patients, we get paid more money, right? The notion was a value-based system where we're going to get paid more if the patient population is getting healthier, right? So the theory behind it makes a whole lot of sense. California still has yet to pull that one off. And I've been pretty deeply involved in, kind of as part of a task force to try to work that through and figure it out. It's incredibly complex and it pushes up against a lot of the norms. It still happens to be, I think, the right thing to do. But it's a tough one to pull it off. Oregon's figured it out. Washington's figured it out. There's some states that have done it, but they're smaller. In California, that's been a real tricky one. So just kind of noting some of those distinctions is really important. If we care about a sustainable business model, we also really need to understand what we're working with here. And so that's part of it. We talked about this program to overhead ratio. I kind of hate talking about program to overhead ratio. It's kind of annoying. But the one thing I do want to just show you is this is literally, when you look at an audited financial statement, you go to the income statement, expenses, maybe not exactly like this. This is an animal welfare organization, but it's going to be broken down into your program services, right, which is here, and then supporting services, which is your overhead. And the program to overhead ratio is looking at the total expenses and what portion is support and what portion is program. Now, this is intended, right? This is coming from Charity Navigator. The intent behind this is to say, look, the more that a business spends up here, the more efficient they are. I kind of say poppycock to that. I don't think that's true. I think all this really tells us is how well the CFO and the CEO have allocated their indirect costs, right? There was a mentor I had many years ago, a guy named Sal. He was a great guy. And I was like, well, what should the cost allocation be? And he said, Brent, what do you want it to be? And he said that in part because there's so much flexibility in terms of how you allocate your indirect costs. I use the CEO's time as an example. How much time are they spending supervising people who are, focused on programs? How much time are they spending fundraising? Are they doing a time study? They don't have to, right? Some of it's just an estimate. So, there's flexibility in there. And yet, we're still, right? I mean, there have been conversations for the last 25 years about this. We're still beholden to this ratio. My main point is it's not a very useful or helpful ratio in terms of making fundraising decisions, nor is it an indicator of how well an organization is run. Okay. There are two ratios, and I don't think we're going to have time to go through them today. But I want to mention them now, and we'll talk about them next week. So one of the ratios is the months of cash ratio. And the actual formula for this is looking at your cash position on the balance sheet. And then that's the numerator. And you're comparing it to your average monthly expenses, or sometimes you do average daily expenses, right? You can hear days of cash or months of cash. And when you get that ratio, basically what that's saying is how many months can an organization continue to cover its average monthly spend with the cash or reserves that it has in the bank, right? If you think of it from a personal example, it's like, right, you've got your rent, you've got, let's say, a car payment, you've got utility bills and food expenses and maybe some entertainment, right? And let's say on average, I don't know, spending $10,000 a month, just making that up, right? So if you've got $30,000 in the bank, then what that means is you've got 3 months worth of expenses, right? You got 3 months of cash on hand. So if the revenues that are coming in for your job, let's say you quit your job, what it's basically saying is you can continue to live your lifestyle for 3 months with the reserves that you have. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So the general benchmark, because I know you guys like benchmarks, and this is one of the places where I'm really comfortable giving one, is that nonprofits should have at a minimum 3 months of cash on hand. I debate this with some people who I have great respect for, but 3 months I think is what you should be aiming for, and really kind of up to 6 months, right? Somewhere between 3 to 6. Subsectors will look a little bit different, but generally speaking, those are kind of the kinds of reserves that you want to have in place. So months of cash is what's called a liquidity ratio. Every single dashboard, every single financial KPI that I present to finance committee and to the board will include months of cash. It will also include something called a current ratio. And again, we'll go into this more next week. I just want to introduce it here. Current ratio is a assets that are cash or easily convertible to cash within a 12-month period. That's the numerator. The denominator are current liabilities, which that's stuff that you're going to need to pay within the next 12 months. Generally speaking, you want a current ratio of 2 or above. What I will tell you now, and you're going to hear me repeat this. So again, I'm just providing some introduction. Don't expect you all to have this mastered. I never present months of cash. Someone's said you can't say never, but this is true. Actually, I never say this, right? I never present months of cash without current ratio because it's current ratio that keeps months of cash honest. And what I mean by that is you can actually overstate your months of cash if you're not paying off your short-term vendors. And the months of cash isn't going to reflect that, but your current ratio will, which is why I think those two need to go hand in hand. Sumaya.
Do these ratios or the months of cash that you'd be expected to have change with, sorry if this is a simple question, but like, do they change with economic headwinds? Like now, for example, when, the economy is super unstable versus like, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, like what are you considering different? Like, is it a different playing field?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So, I mean, external factors are always going to have an impact. So, I mean, sometimes, if you have if you have funders who are taking longer to pay you, right, that's going to affect cash. Your accounts receivable are going to, kind of tick up. And we'll talk about, there's another ratio around accounts receivable. And again, folks, I just want to share, I'm throwing language and terms and ratios out at you. I don't expect 100% absorption right now. I'm providing an introduction. We will dig into this some more. So if, and again, I'm not sure where everyone is, but let's say you're at 30%, 50%, whatever it is. I assure you, by the middle of this semester, you will be 90 to 100%. I hope. And if not, come talk to me. We'll set up some separate time to connect. Jessica, you have a question.
Yeah, what are like the different instances where you would use like days cash on hand versus like months of cash?
Yeah, I prefer using months of cash, but you can really use either. I think it's a preference. I just find it easier to look at months of cash. You're just dividing it by 12. So you're taking your annual expenses and dividing it by 12. But you can do it either way. I think days of cash is a more common usage. I also have more of a lending background and lending training. We tended to use months of cash when we did our underwriting, and so it's just what I've gotten more familiar with. But it's up to you.
Got it. Thank you.
Thung, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed that, but when you use cash, like it's the total cash you have when you make the report, or the cash associated with the month in the report?
Yeah, generally, so it's a good question if I understand your question correctly. So you will take the most recent month-end report. So it is a historical looking ratio. It's what's already occurred. So for example, at Lifelong, so we are now on September 4th. My team has 10 business days to close the books. So the accountants basically are collecting all of the invoices and making sure they're tracking all of the expenses and the revenues, and they close the books. And then my FP&A team has basically 3 days with my partnership to prepare the month-end financial statement, which is an income statement and the balance sheet. And then we're pulling the cash position from that income from the balance sheet and looking at the expenses from the income statement. So, it's basically once you close the month, then we're looking at some of these ratios.
Okay, thank you.
And what I will show you here, remember the organization that had about 4 days of cash on hand? You can kind of see it here, right? So oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on what this is called, but the kind of the filled in area in blue is looking at the months of cash on hand, which it's a dual axis graph. So it's the the y-axis to the right. And so you can see in 2013 and into 2014, they were well below 2 weeks of cash on hand. You know, so it was basically running on fumes. And then what you saw over basically a 3.5-year period was the cash position really start to dramatically improve. And what allowed that to happen was through the generation of surpluses. What allowed the surpluses to happen had a lot to do with some aggressive pricing adjustments, going back to funders and optimizing the contracts, as well as some consolidation on how much we were paying on some of our debt. But the visuals are pretty powerful, and there's some value in that. So we're not going to calculate these two ratios tonight. There's just not time to do it. But there are some other things I want to share with you. So this is the income statement, also known in the nonprofit space as the statement of activities. Can everyone see this okay? If you need a closer look, if you go into B courses, into files, there's a folder that says something to the effect of in-class assignments. And there's a PowerPoint presentation that shows income statement and the balance sheet. You got the same thing. So what you have here is you see there's an unrestricted column and a temporarily restricted column, which these days is called without restrictions and with restrictions. It's the same thing. And then it totals up. Does everyone see that? Okay. Remember earlier, someone asked a very good question around restricted dollars. Well, restricted dollars get released from restriction. There's actually a line item there that says net assets released from restriction. Does everybody see that? Net assets released from restriction, right? And you see there's $1,087,000 that gets transferred out of this column into this column. Why? Because the transfer occurs in order for these restricted dollars to be released from restriction, or basically become unrestricted, in order to cover the expenses for which they were intended. That's fundamentally what's happening here. So in this case, you have some foundation support. There's some restricted dollars that have come in, but they also released more dollars than they brought in this year. Do y'all see that? So they brought in 758,000, but they released $1,087,000. How is that possible? This is starting to get at the crux of what makes reading and interpreting nonprofit financial statements a little more complex and counterintuitive. How can you release more money than you receive in a given year?
Because of a multi-year grant, like, you know, money that was scheduled to be transferred from restricted to unrestricted gets transferred just by the passage of time.
Yep. So that's exactly right. And the only thing Samuel, thank you for that. What I would add to it is there are restricted dollars that have been booked in prior years that are then released in this year. And you can actually see it down here where it says net assets beginning of the period. It's 395,000. Net assets at the end of the period. This column here, these two lines, these are actually balance sheet line items that you have here. But basically, this is your beginning restricted balance, and this is your ending restricted balance. And the 328,000 that you see here, which brings the balance from the beginning of the year at 395 down to 66, is the fact that they released 328,000 more than they brought in this year. So part of this release is from dollars that they had recognized in previous years. I'm talking a lot. Is this landing? And do folks need clarification on this? Uriel?
And by released, do we think of that as spent?
Yes. Yes. Once it goes into the unrestricted column, and again, we will talk more about this, and I realize I'm throwing a lot at you. There's something called matching principle. And matching principle is a way of presenting financials where you're recognizing the revenues in the same period, and the revenues and the expenses that allowed those revenues to be recognized in the same period. You want to match those two together. And so that's what's happening in this unrestricted column here. Okay. So let's keep going through this, because then I'm going to have some questions for you guys. I think we're doing okay on time. So So under revenues, we have support. In this case, think foundation support. There's some consulting revenue for this organization. There are some individual contributions. There's some other stuff that's not captured up above here. And then you have the net assets released from restrictions. And then you have total revenues. And you have that in the unrestricted column, temporary, and then the total is you're just adding these two columns together. Everyone with me so far? Okay. Now we have our expenses broken into that annoying, breakdown of what's program and overhead, right? We've got program expenses of 1.15 million, management in general of 164,000, fundraising of 94,000. And so total expenses is 1,414,336. Does everyone see that? Okay. Notice, this is important, y'all. There are no expenses in this temporarily restricted column. Everyone see that? It's blank. There will never be expenses in the temporarily restricted column. Why? Because you need to release the dollars in the unrestricted column to cover the expenses for which they were intended. Okay. So we've got about 9 minutes left. I'm going to ask you guys a basic question. But before I do that, I'm going to start to give you part of the answer. Change in net assets is a nonprofit term for surplus or deficit. Change in net assets is a nonprofit term for surplus or deficit. Change in net assets is not the same as net assets. We'll talk more about that. Net assets is a balance sheet term. Change in net assets is just a surplus or deficit. Everyone with me? Okay, you guys, here's your I'm a really smart Berkeley grad student question. Did this organization generate a surplus or a deficit? Big question of the day. And by the way, don't feel bad if you don't get it right. I've had conversations with Goldman Sachs executives, much to their disappointment. They didn't answer this question correctly. But did this organization generate a surplus or a deficit? Who wants to start it off? Gabe, surplus or deficit?
Deficit. And
Deficit.
I'm looking at, because their total revenue on the right side column is less than their total expenses.
Okay. And so what's the deficit?
It would be that negative 246,440.
Nope.
Oh.
That's not negative.
Oh,
The 297 number. 297, 631.
297, 631. Right? Y'all see that? Gabe, you got that too? Because this number here, it's not negative, this is balance sheet information. We'll get more into this. Again, you guys, this is our first pass at this. So, we're just getting started here, I promise. So Gabe is saying they ran a deficit, Brent. Like, duh. We looked at the total column, $297,000 loss. Is everyone lined up with that? Are we good? Yeah? Gabe, we got it right. We've got a $297,000 loss. Okay, are we done? Should we wrap up class for the night? We've got 7 minutes left. What if I told you that on an operating basis, they actually ran a surplus? What would you think? Is that just me being a contrarian, being annoying? Like, how could that be possible?
I would say yes.
That I'm a contrarian and I'm annoying?
No. That that there was
my daughter would say that would be true, but she's 14, so go ahead, Zoe. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I'm reading it as like the literal bottom line under total, like the 246,440 is that even after like all of like that, even after the change in net assets, like was a deficit on that line item, they still had $246,440 more than like what would have been break even, I guess.
So Zoe, if this was an extra credit question, I would give you partial credit for that because I think that's a really thoughtful response. It's unfortunate. It's not correct, but it's a really thoughtful response. So basically what Zoe's saying is, look, they ran a $297,000 loss, but if you look at the net assets at the beginning of the period, yeah, it eroded their net assets, but their net assets are still positive. Again, these are balance sheet items, which we'll talk more about. So I want everyone for the moment, just for the moment. And Zoe, thank you for sharing that. I love just seeing your thinking and thought process on that. I thought that was really good. If for the moment, pretend that these last two lines aren't here and just stay focused on the change in net assets. If I said on an operating basis they ran a surplus, can anyone venture to guess what I mean by that? Andrea.
Is it because under the unrestricted column, their change in net assets is a $30,000 surplus?
Yeah. So here's the thing, y'all. I'm going to leave you with this with the few minutes that we have left. When you're looking at a not-for-profit income statement, go to the unrestricted column first. Because the unrestricted column is the best reflection of how the organization performed in that year. The total column is the summation of unrestricted plus whatever the changes in the temporarily restricted are. So if you just do some simple math, that $297,000 loss is driven primarily by the fact that they released 328,000 more of restricted revenues than they received in that year. But it's actually not reflecting the financial performance for the year operationally. That's what the unrestricted column does. And by the way, this is precisely the conversation I had with some Goldman Sachs execs. I can appreciate people who are smarter than I am, not to say that every Goldman Sachs exec was. This person who I spoke to was. I happen to know a little more about this topic, and that's all I'm here to do is share this with y'all, right? So the unrestricted column, what's happening here, right? Any of those restricted dollars that get released are going into the unrestricted column in order to fund the activities that occurred in that period. Remember I said there's no such thing as temporarily restricted expenses, right? That whole section is blank. So anytime that you're using restricted dollars to cover expenses, you must release them into that unrestricted column. So really, it's this column that matters most to us. But as you all did, which is by the way, the rational and logical thing to do is you guys went to the total column. Total column's okay, but it's just noting that this loss is driven 100% by the fact that they released more restricted dollars than they received in this year. So the last point I want to make, what's the takeaway for this? Why? It's like, what's the so what? It's like, okay, Brent, so great. You've taught us about FASB 116, 117. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week too. Why is that important? Well, imagine for a moment you're the chair of a board of an organization that just lost $300,000 on a $1.4 million budget, right? That's a 20% loss about for the year. Our board chair would look at this and say, okay, what are you guys going to do about that? And it might result in some cuts, right? It's a very different conversation to say, hey, actually, on an operating basis, we ran a $30,000 surplus, right? Not great, but we were slightly better than break even, right? We don't need to make any draconian measures at this particular point in time, let's just say. So it's the reading and the interpreting of these financial statements in order to help inform decisions. That's so important. If we misread, we may end up making the wrong decision, right? So this is where, again, go to that unrestricted column first. You're going to hear me say that about 1,000 times between now and the end of the semester, okay? Any final questions before we split? Gabe, you get the last word here.
So are the parentheses meant to be negative? Because I am seeing like
parentheses are negative.
328. There's that 328,000, and then doing the 328,000 minus 297 yields the 30,000.
Correct.
Number on the left. So what?
Yep.
How come on financial statements they just do parentheses instead of just marking it as negative. Is there a reason behind that?
Term of art. I mean, it's just the practice.
Got
That's
it.
typically what you're going to say. It's just the practice. But yes, the parentheses, those are the negative numbers. That's what's in red, if you will. Gabe, thank you for that. Folks, thanks everyone for your time. Ben, do you have a minute to stick around, or are you
Yep.
you need to run? Okay, perfect.
Hang.
All right.
Thanks, Brent.
Thanks everyone. I'm
Thank you.
gonna
Thanks, Brent.
stop the share. See y'all next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, stop recording.